Well, this morning we continue in a series that we started 5 weeks ago. It's our summer series, and it's about faith. It's about Bible characters. It's about these very well-known stories. We'll be looking at a few stories as we go through the series that might not be as well-known, but for the most part, you've heard of these people's names, and you've heard of them ever since Sunday school. And so this morning we're talking about Sarah. And we're talking about her surrender to God, to hearing Him, and to believing Him. And we're really going to concentrate on her story as we are reminded of it in Hebrews 11, verses 11 through 16. This is the fifth in our series, Bible stories that don't grow old. And we should love to hear them, and we should love to learn from them year by year and gain new perspectives and new insights. Now, throughout the Bible, we see people's names being changed. Starting in the New Testament and working back to the Old Testament, we see that Saul of Tarsus became the Apostle Paul. We see that the tax collector Levi became Matthew. We see that Simon the fisherman became Peter. We see that King Solomon was named Jedediah by God Himself. We see that Naomi, after losing her husband and her sons, changed her name to Mara. We see that Jacob was renamed by God Israel. And we see that Abram, the one who fathered the nation of Israel, the one who is the ancestral heritage of Israel, was renamed Abraham by God. Now, it wasn't just Abram receiving a new name, but his wife also received a new name. Sarah's old name was Sarai. And really, the words Sarah and Sarai are very similar. And there's only a little bit of difference between the two names. Her name, Sarai, meant my princess. It was a personal and intimate name. It's a name that applied maybe to her parents as she was born, and they said, "Oh, look at our little princess." It's a name that endeared her to Abram, and there was a personal relationship there. But when Sarai finally listened to God, and when she accepted His blessings, her name was changed from my princess to princess of all. And her lesson is something we need to pay attention to. We can be a blessing to others. We don't just need to bless the immediate family around us or our immediate friends, but we can be a blessing to so many other people as we hear and as we believe God. And so that's what Hebrews 11 is telling us in verses 11 through 16. Abraham's already been talked about, and we spoke about him last week, but now we need to speak about his wife, Sarah. By faith, in verse 11, by faith Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. On July 4th this year, we will be celebrating 247 years of this nation's history. And I would dare say that everyone in here is thankful and proud to be an American. But by what the Hebrew writer is telling us about Abraham and Sarah and their venture of faith and obedience, they were more interested in the country to come. They were more interested in pledging their allegiance to God himself. And so they were commended for that. Let's understand, first of all, that people of faith do struggle with doubt. Abraham and Sarah did. But they don't stay in that place of doubt. They grow through it. They move on. They learn from it. Eventually, people who struggle and doubt need to make a choice. They need to choose to believe in spite of what they see, and they need to choose to believe in spite of what they experience. Do you remember Garrison Keillor, who was the host of the radio show on public radio called Prairie Home Companion? A lot of good stuff was on that show, a lot of entertainment, a lot of good stories. But Keillor once said this. He said, sometimes you have to look reality in the eye and deny it. And that's the way some people think faith is. We look at what's real, but then we're saying, oh no, my faith is beyond that. My faith is in the make-believe. My faith is in the fairy tale. My faith is in what everyone else knows is not true. But that's not the case. That is not why we are people of faith. It is not unusual for people of faith to experience doubt. But somewhere along the line, if we are going to be people of faith, we have to decide to trust God. It doesn't matter how much you may have doubted up to that point. When you make your decision to trust God and you lay aside the doubts, that's when your walk of faith truly begins. And that's why Sarah is listed here, because she doubted what God was saying. Now, my biggest struggle with faith happened my freshman year of Bible college. I had committed myself to Christ as a child. I was baptized at the age of 9. And by the time I was 11, I mentioned in a class in elementary school, when the teacher asked what we wanted to be when we grew up, I mentioned that I thought I'd like to be a preacher. First time those words ever came out of my mouth, tender age of 11. Throughout my high school years, I was able to win my friends to Christ. I baptized a number of them. And I received some financial help to attend Johnson Bible College. I was given a scholarship. And so everything seemed on track until my freshman year. I was thrilled when I got there. I was thrilled at the element of faith that was going on there. But one evening during a chapel service, I listened to people praying, and I didn't have my eyes closed. I listened to people praying, and I honestly wondered for the first time in my life, God, are you really out there, or are these words just bouncing against the ceiling and coming back at us? And I was crushed. I was crushed by it. I didn't know what to do about it. And I struggled for about 2 weeks. It hurt my grades. It hurt my relationships with people. I found myself pulling away because I was wondering, why am I even at this place? God, are you real? I doubted. And so did Sarah. We have to get to a point where faith overcomes doubt. And how do we do that? With all the difficulties and with all the disappointments that we have in this life, how do we trust God? It's hard, folks. It's hard, especially when we go through crises. So let's go back and let's look at the first verse of Hebrews chapter 11, the definition of faith. Here the writer said, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. And with that one sentence, the writer went into this roll call of faith. And right now we're looking at Sarah, who was mentioned in it. D.L. Moody, a famous preacher from the 19th century, said this. He said, I prayed for faith and thought that someday it would come down and strike me like lightning. But faith didn't seem to come. Then one day, I read in Romans that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. I had, up to this time, closed my Bible, and prayed for faith. Now I open my Bible and I study, and faith has been growing ever since. So what about my crisis of faith? What about my struggle so many years ago at Johnson Bible College? My recovery began when I went to the prayer room in the old main building at the very top, in the cupola, in the base of the cupola on the building. I left my dorm about 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and so I trudged up the hill, went to the original building on the campus, and I didn't pray for a while. I looked at the prayer journals. I looked at what other people had prayed. I looked at what other people had written. As I flipped through the prayer journals and saw all the anguish that was there, I also saw tear stains on the paper. And I saw people were struggling with their faith too. And I said, God, you are here. Not because of this room and not because of this campus, but you are here because you are true. I wrote something in that prayer journal, and then I trudged down 4 floors of staircase, back to the crisp night air, walked back to the dorm, quietly got into bed, and my roommate said, Tom. I said, yeah. He said, where you been? I said, I was in the prayer room in Old Main. He flipped the light on, and he looked at me, and he said, no, you weren't. I said, yeah, I was. He said, you may have been in that prayer room at Old Main, but you were really with God. I can see it in your face. How powerful is that? When you doubt, and God comes through, and God speaks to you, and God ministers to you, how powerful is that? People of faith do struggle with doubt. But we need to also understand that people of faith must listen to God. That's probably how Sarah became a woman of faith. That's probably why she's listed among all these heroes of faith. She listened to God. She heard God. And once she heard him, her doubt began to fade. If you go back to the original story in Genesis 18, you find this. Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? And then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Well, Sarah was afraid, and so she lied to God. She said, I did not laugh. But God said, yes, you did laugh. Now, drawing on 10 years of research and experience on the study of laughter, Dr. Robert Provine, the world's leading expert on the field, said this. He said, one of the remarkable things about laughter is that it occurs unconsciously. You don't decide to do it. We don't consciously produce laughter. That's why it's very hard to laugh on command, or why it's hard to fake laughter. And that's probably what happened to Sarah. She wasn't mocking God. It's just that after all these years of being barren and trying to have a child, she struggled with her feelings and she struggled with her doubt. And now in her old age, God says, you and your husband are going to have a son. And so she laughed. Ha! It just came out. Yeah, we're going to have a son? Well, come on, we've tried all this time, and everything we've tried hasn't worked. But now Sarah's listening to God, and she's listening to God speak, and he is speaking to her. And she heard him say 3 things. First of all, God said that he knew that she had laughed. I know you laughed. Now, she had been inside the tent, and Abraham was meeting with 3 men of God outside the tent. She didn't think that God could hear her when she was sheltered in their home, but she forgot who God was. She forgot that she could have been 3 miles away or half a world away, and God would still have heard her. You see, God knows our inward thoughts. He knows them even before we think them. And that's why God is who he is, and that's why we think even though we might be able to hide our thoughts and our feelings from him, we can't. We can't. We may think we're hiding our thoughts and our feelings from others, but we can't hide them from God. I will tell you, after 47 years in ministry, in conversations I've had with people usually in the community, when they find out I am a preacher or they've known me as a minister in this town or any other town I've served in, if they happen to have a problem with foul language and a word slips, and they're in front of a preacher when the word slips, what do they usually say? Pardon my French. I didn't know those words were French. But if I know the person well enough, I'll say it's not me you need to be asking pardon for. God hears you all the time. Because he is who he is. And we can't hide things from God. And so she couldn't hide her laughter. She couldn't hide her doubt. And God said, you did laugh. He didn't scold her. He just simply stated, you did laugh. But I'm promising you this. I will be back in a year and you'll have a son. Wow. In her old age. After all the times that they tried. So for the first time, she personally heard God's promise. Up until then, God had been speaking to Abraham. But now she heard from God directly. Now she heard God say, I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and you'll have a boy. God said something Sarah would have never thought about before. God said this. He said, is anything too hard for the Lord? Tell me, Sarah, is there anything I cannot do? Come on, Sarah, I'm promising you this. Don't doubt, but listen to me. Believe and follow through with your belief. We need to ask the same question. People who struggle with their faith are struggling with problems and with obstacles that they cannot handle. We can't deal with those things. And so we wonder, we worry, we wring our hands, we fret, we stew, we get scared. And we wonder if God really cares. We wonder if maybe he's not up to the challenge I have in my life. Maybe that's why things are going to hell in a handbasket. We wonder because we've tried to do it by ourselves and of our own means. But God is up to the challenge. God does care. And he's big enough to take care of our needs. And so people of faith need to listen to what God says. Finally, people of faith need to accept God's blessings on God's terms. Ooh, that's hard to do. To accept God's blessings on God's terms. Sooner or later, we all must decide. Sooner or later, we've got to personally come to the point where we make a decision as to whether we are going to trust God or whether we are not going to trust God. And God asks us the same question. Put your name in Sarah's place. God's speaking to you. And he says, is anything too hard for me? He's mentioned that several times in the scriptures. In Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 2, God asked the nation of Israel, was my arm too short to ransom you, to save you? Do I lack the strength to rescue you? No. But our doubt sometimes makes it feel that way. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, Paul spoke to the Christians there in Ephesus, and he wrote, God is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. His power, his spirit, his presence. He is going to overcome, and he will help us become overcomers. And that's probably what changed Sarah. That's probably what changed her mind. That's probably what made her believe. She heard God. She spoke to God. And God spoke to her. Ultimately, she said this in Genesis 21, verse 6, God has brought me laughter. And everyone who hears about this will laugh along with me. Sarah, a year later, gave birth to the child that was promised to her and to Abraham by God. And everyone laughed. Going back in the story, when Abraham first met with God in Genesis 17, Abraham laughed when God said that Sarah would have a child. You know how old we are, God? You know that things aren't working the way they used to? Come on, God. That's kind of funny that we're going to have a child. In Genesis 18, Sarah laughed in her tent at the notion of having a child in her old age. She said, we're way beyond our years. How in the world can I have this pleasure of birthing a child and having my own son? And in Genesis 21, Abraham named their son, the promise of God, Isaac. You know what Isaac means? He laughs. So everyone that met Isaac probably said, he said, hi, I'm Isaac. And they said, what's the joke? Why are you laughing? He reminded everyone he encountered, just by his name, that there is joy in the Lord. And that we can have that joy when we listen to God, when we believe God, and when we follow through with God's commands. That's so important that we understand that laughter is in store for those who listen and obey. Now, this is such a neat story. It seems like it should end with the words, and they all lived happily ever after, the end. But do you realize that because Isaac was born, because Abraham and Sarah believed, that we have Jesus Christ? Do you realize we have salvation because the line and the lineage came through Isaac? Paul tells us that when Sarah gave birth to Isaac, Isaac's birth would reflect our salvation. He said this in Galatians chapter 4. Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman, Hagar, and the other by a free woman, Sarah. But when the son of the slave was born, according to the flesh, according to their plans and their ideas, the son of the free woman was born through a promise of God. And now you, like Isaac, are children of that promise. Paul was writing to the Christians. And he said if it wasn't for Abraham and Sarah's faith, if it wasn't for their follow-through, if it wasn't for their obedience and their belief, we would have no reason to laugh. We would have no reason to know there's a promise waiting for us. And so here's the point. Sarah couldn't do anything of and by herself to get pregnant. She and Abraham tried to do so for years, and nothing happened. And now in their old age, they certainly gave up. But in the same way, the Bible teaches us that no one can do anything of their own accord and by their own means to be saved. We cannot earn our way to heaven by being good people. We cannot earn our way to heaven by going to church. We cannot earn our way to heaven by giving offerings. We can't do it by ourselves. And if we think we're doing it by ourselves, we're going to be wringing our hands and wondering if we're ever going to do it well enough. We're going to be afraid of hell even though we say we're saved. Folks, the only way Sarah got pregnant was by obeying God's promise. And she was way too old to become pregnant in any other way. Likewise, the only way we have any hope of salvation is through God's promise. We are way too sinful to be saved by any other means. We need Jesus. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9 tells us that it is by grace we have been saved through faith, and it is not of our own doing. It is a gift from God. It is not the result of our works, of our earning our salvation, because no one should be able to boast about what they've done, but what God has done. And so we can't do anything that will earn our salvation. It is a gift from God. It's something God has promised us, and all God asks is that we accept his gift on His terms, that we don't change the rules, that we don't write it the way we think it ought to say, but we listen to God and we believe Him and we obey Him. We need to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the living God. And we need to believe that Jesus is the only way that we can be saved. We need to acknowledge that we have sinned and we have fallen short of God's glory. And we need to repent of those sins and determine not to live like that anymore, but to change direction and change course and quit following the world and return to following God. We need to confess that Jesus will be our Lord and our Master here and forevermore, and that we will let Him own everything we have, and we will let Him control everything that we are. We need to allow ourselves to be buried in the waters of baptism and rise in new creations, filled and led by the Holy Spirit of God. And so let's learn something from Sarah. Let's not become impatient with God's timing. Let's not take things of God into our own hands, but instead, let us wait upon the Lord. And when we wait upon the Lord, He will renew our strength. We will fly with wings of eagles. We will run and not grow weary. We will walk and not be faint. Because we believe and we follow. And He blesses. Now, if you don't have those blessings, there's a solution. Come to Jesus. Quit trying to do it on your own. Come to Jesus. Surrender to Him. Confess your sin. Confess your faith. Follow Him. Be baptized. Be led by His Spirit. And you'll know laughter too. You'll know laughter that will overcome any obstacle we have in this world. It's up to us to follow. And we invite you, because He invites us all, to laugh again. If you're ready for that, you can come forward this morning. You can name Jesus as Lord and be baptized into Him. It's time. And for some of us, it's way past time. And the clock ticks. And we need to decide. So if you're ready, please come to know the one who will give you laughter. Come to Jesus. Let's stand together and let's sing this song. And if you need to make that decision for Christ, we invite you to come forward this morning.